what philosophy is in the Christian context, namely the handmaid to theology, an entirely independent standing discipline, but one which, in a Christian context, is ordered to the same thing that theology is, namely to bring us into greater knowledge of God through knowing the world that He has created. And so philosophy, like theology, orders us to God and helps us to attain happiness.
Well, good morning, and welcome again to the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology, and welcome back to those who have been able to attend a talk so far. We're, of course, very sorry about having to cancel the last scheduled talk. We were, of course, as most of you know, smothered in very toxic smoke, so we thought it best not to ask you all to travel to DSPT in that smoke. So thank you again for coming out. My name is Aaron Anderson. I am the Director of Admissions here at the school, and this is our final talk in the series Aquinas in Contemporary Conversation with Professor Gable. In this talk, he'll lead us in a conversation about Thomas Aquinas' relationship to law, jurisprudence, and specifically what Aquinas might have to say about the Supreme Court, natural law, and ethics. Briefly before I invite him up, I'd like to thank you for your attendance at these talks. We hope to offer more such talks in the future, and of course, if you've enjoyed engaging with us so far, please do check out our website, dspt.edu/events, for more events coming up. We offer a whole lot of public events in addition to our student events, and so offhand, a number coming up would be the Aquinas Lecture in February, the Convocation of the College of Fellows, which will be a 2-day conversation on the role of the laity here at the school, and then one I'm excited about personally is our annual CDSPT event. So it's our Prospective Student Week, and it's a 3-day event lined up with plenty of opportunities for class visits, faculty appointments, student socials, and so if you have any inkling of interest in the school and at least experience in what campus life is like, you're welcome to come join very serious applicants alongside others, maybe like yourselves, that are just curious about the school. So I do invite you to come talk to me afterwards about that, and also to pick up any literature outside after the talk, which will be on the table. And now Professor Gable. He is a professor here of philosophy at DSPT and has been since 2014. He earned both his MA and his PhD at Fordham University. And at our school, he has taught courses on ethics, the life of Edith Stein, and much more. And most recently, he chaired the organizing committee for our DSPT Triennial Colloquium, which is a very exciting initiative for the next 3 years focused around the topics of person, soul, and consciousness here at the school. So it is my pleasure to once again and finally introduce Professor Gable.
Well, thank you very much, all of you, for coming, especially on this rainy day and especially in December. After Thanksgiving is always a really hectic time, so thank you for coming and taking the time to support this kind of ongoing venture that we have. Again, I might have mentioned in the first talk I gave that I had a number of people who'd come up to me and say, you know, I work full-time, but I'd really like to attend more events at the Dominican School. But you guys don't have anything on Saturdays. So, you know, after hearing that for a few years, I thought, okay, we've got to do something about that. So this is our attempt to provide something on Saturday for people who just couldn't possibly make it at any other time, and hopefully to expand what we do here at the DSPT, because of course we're not just a school, we're also a ministry of the Dominican province, and we are preaching the gospel in our own way. So, thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to try to do the impossible. I spend a number of weeks teaching natural law in my Introduction to Ethics class, and I would probably spend even more time if it weren't for the fact that there is a sequel course that basically spends the entire semester talking about natural law. And then Father Edward gives an elective on natural law. So this is the kind of topic that we could spend hours and hours and hours and still only scratch the surface. And in addition to that, I've added on to this the optimistic and probably completely unrealistic idea that I might actually also talk about grace. So forgive me, but we'll probably not get there. So anyway, this is what we're going to do. But natural law is so very important because we have to have some way of talking about how it is that we can talk about ethical discourse. And more, you probably noticed in the last few years or so, ethics in politics is becoming harder and harder to talk about in a civil manner. Part of that is when we don't have a common discourse, we don't have common principles, it often becomes a kind of shouting match. That is, I simply try to out-talk you and you try to out-talk me because there's no really common ground that we can meet upon. And one of my contentions this morning is that natural law could possibly provide such a common basis. Not that it necessarily will, but I think it very well could and perhaps should. But before we go further, let's say a quick prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. All together, come, Holy Spirit, divine Creator, true source of light and fountain of wisdom. Pour forth your brilliance upon my dense intellect. Dissipate the darkness which covers me, that of sin and of ignorance. Grant me a penetrating mind to understand, a retentive memory, method and ease in learning, the lucidity to comprehend, and abundant grace in expressing myself. Guide the beginning of my work, direct its progress, and bring it to successful completion. This I ask through Jesus Christ, true God and true man, living and reigning with you and the Father, forever and ever. Amen. So there are a few things that I think, and this is going to be my contention here this morning, that natural law is going to be very useful for. One is for clarifying the very idea of natural rights. Natural rights are hopefully something that we've all heard a lot about, and I think in general that's a good thing. So for instance, one of the fundamental documents of the UN is its Declaration on Human Rights, dated from 1946, I believe. Jacques Maritain and other Catholic intellectuals were actually a part of the framing and wording of this document. And it articulates on a practical level a number of important human rights. What the UN Declaration does not mention is necessarily the foundation of those rights, or at least not in detail. Same with the Civil Rights Act that was signed by Lyndon Johnson in 1964. This is the picture here. And the subsequent civil rights movement. We have a very clear articulation of the rights themselves, but the foundation of those rights remain largely unclarified. And this is true of rights language in general. So we hear rights language being used all the time. So-and-so or such-and-such group has a right or a natural right or an inalienable right to fill in the blank. But there's very little justification for why that right exists. And I believe that justification would ultimately end up appealing to something like natural law. As it currently stands, because it remains unclarified, the language of rights often acts as a kind of trump card. That is, someone is making an ethical argument and you say, but I have a right to, and you lay down your trump card and you automatically win the argument. Now that's very nice, but what happens when someone else plays their trump card at the same time? We're going to talk about that. Natural rights require clarification because there are a whole bunch of them, and they tend to interact and, as we'll see, interfere with one another. So what are rights? Where do they come from? And when they conflict, how do we decide which are primary? Natural law, I believe, is the way to actually answer these kinds of questions. There's also the issue of the interpretation of law. How do we, and especially the courts, from our local level courts to the Supreme Court, decide how to interpret and apply laws? Now, of course, there are lots of legal procedures, and any good attorney would tell you what kinds of procedures those are. But I also would contend that in the background functions a certain conception of natural law. That is, an overarching idea of what is naturally just or unjust that helps guide deliberation and interpretation, and should. This is important for us to remember because, as we'll see a little bit later, there is, at the current time, a kind of idea in several different spheres that there can be a kind of value-neutral position. So we have a myth of a kind of value-neutral or neutral public forum that doesn't include particular moral, ethical, or religious beliefs. And I would say that this is one of the biggest and most destructive myths we currently face. The fact of the matter is that when we're interpreting laws or when we are reporting in the news, we are going to have a perspective, and it's going to be impossible for us to neutralize that perspective. We're going to have some kind of overall vision of human life and human nature, and that's going to guide our thinking. So there has been a lot of recent criticism of the press. I think a lot of it is incredibly justified. But the larger issue, which hasn't been addressed, is one of the reasons the press is not objective anymore is because it never really was, because that kind of objectivity is not really possible. And the more polarized we get, the more we notice that there are some outlets of mainstream media that are incredibly at odds with our perspective, whether that be because you tend towards one end of the spectrum or the other, politically speaking. So there is no neutral ground. We have to have a set of values that functions, and those values need to be examined. So simply being able to bracket them and put them to the side is a kind of myth that, again, can cause us a lot of problems if we allow it to direct our discourse and our thinking. Now, actually, this is a conversation I just had a couple minutes ago, which is someone said, I think natural law is a little bit like the original owner's manual for being human. And that's not entirely untrue. I like that image. The one problem is that natural law is actually a little bit more difficult to discern and articulate than simply reading an owner's manual. So I don't want to say your owner's manual is in Chinese, but let's say there's just perhaps you're not a very good reader. We have to put some effort into discerning the natural law. And that makes sense, because if the natural law were kind of a complete and straightforward manner, we'd have a lot of trouble explaining why it is that there is so much ethical contention. Why do we have moral disagreement if something like natural law were a plain and straightforward kind of thing? I don't think it is. Well, at least on one level. So later on, I'm going to distinguish between general precepts and secondary precepts of the natural law. And my argument, and this is going to be following Aquinas, is that primary precepts are relatively straightforward and almost universally accepted. So when's the last time you had an argument with somebody who insisted that murder was okay? Now, the kind of moral discussion that you might have is whether something qualifies as murder or not, right? The same thing goes for theft. Even thieves do not want to be stolen from, right? They want to be the exception to the rule, so they don't actually think theft is a good thing. But we might actually have a discussion about what is theft and what is not. And St. Thomas, for instance, will say that in a time of famine or someone is unable to feed their family in any other way, stealing bread is in fact not theft at all. So the issues can get very complicated when we get down into the nitty-gritty details of it, and this is why secondary precepts or particular conclusions of the natural law can admit of a great deal of debate. But there is very little debate at the highest level, and even amongst a very legitimate cultural and historical diversity that has been noted by historians and scholars, we actually see that there is a lot more uniformity than is sometimes acknowledged. Again, we don't have a whole lot of societies that condone murder, theft, suicide, or actually even lying. And part of the reason that is because such societies that condone such things don't last very long at all. So how is it that natural law is revealed to us? Well, we're going to look at a few instances of that in just a moment, but natural law doesn't really become an issue for us kind of in our ordinary practical life when we're just humming along in our everyday routine. It's only when a particular problem arises that natural law really comes to the fore. And one of these scenarios is when we encounter laws that are in themselves unjust, when they become questionable in one way or another in the light of a higher truth, or they're contrasted, we might say, to that higher truth. So when we discern that a law is unjust, we feel that there is a higher law, a higher justice that serves as a standard which this law fails to meet. And this becomes a way of revealing the natural law to us. This is, in fact, more or less the theme of Sophocles' Antigone. And here is a work by Sebastian Norblin from 1825 called Antigone donna la sepulture à Police. So this is Antigone at the tomb of her brother, pleading to bury him. King Creon has not allowed her to do so. He has forbidden that, but Antigone does it anyway and is punished. So she is forbidden to mourn and to bury her brother. She ultimately defies that decree of the king. King Creon eventually finds out, and she is basically sentenced to death by being buried alive herself in a tomb. Now, at the end of the play, King Creon repents, goes to get Antigone out of the tomb. Unfortunately, Antigone has already hung herself. This is very classically tragic Greek. And it basically ends very poorly for everybody. King Creon's son, who was in love with Antigone, commits suicide. And as a kind of domino effect, his mother, King Creon's wife, also kills herself in despair over her son's suicide. So an entire series of tragedy ensues before the story closes. I'm sorry I gave it all away to you without telling you spoilers. I'm sorry. Hashtag spoilers. So forget what I said, except for the point that Antigone sees in King Creon's law something unjust and something against a higher divine law. And we might say this would be an illustration of what we would call today natural law. And when natural law is not followed, there are perhaps some rather interesting and tragic consequences, and we'll talk about that as well. Now, a classic case I go over with my students every year is Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail. And I'll just go ahead and read you the quotation. One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? And here we're talking about civil disobedience in the civil rights movement. The answer lies in the fact that there are two types of laws, just and unjust. Now, what is the difference between the two? How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, yes, Martin Luther King Jr. here is quoting St. Thomas Aquinas. He says, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal and natural law. So here we have natural law thinking being used explicitly by the leader of the civil rights movement to talk about the injustice of an existing human or positive law. And we might see this as being one of the key aspects of natural law, is it's very hard for us to talk about how laws might be unjust if human laws, their very existence, is supposed to be the answer to the question of justice or injustice. That is, just because the law exists seems to be insufficient because we have, in fact, experienced laws that don't quite meet up to the standards that we think is actually just. How do we talk about that? Well, natural law is one of the ways that we do that. To give a very extreme example, in the trials at Nuremberg, we have a whole lot of people who basically said, I was just following orders. I was just following the law. And yet, that wasn't a sufficient excuse, was it? There are a lot of people who were sentenced to prison or death as a result of their part in the Third Reich, who were actually being very truthful. That was the law. In fact, they might have been in a lot of trouble if they had tried to disobey it. And yet that wasn't enough of a rationale to talk about justice in the full sense. Here, Martin Luther is talking about something similar, namely that there are existing laws, but just because they're on the books doesn't mean that that is sufficient to meet the standard of justice. There is a higher natural standard that we have to look toward. I look for any excuse to use Flannery O'Connor in lectures in my classes because she's wonderful. And whenever I tease people about reading the Summa right before they go to bed, I get that from Flannery O'Connor because that's in fact what she did. She was a brilliant woman and a wonderful novelist. And you can see some of her little gems there. I use a short story that my students have already read this semester. It's called The Enduring Chill. And it's about a young man named Asbury who finds himself terribly ill and forced to accept the care of his mother, basically for the rest of his life, because he's chronically ill. And that doesn't sound so bad to us, but it was very bad for him because he hated his mother. She was ignorant, conventional, and backwards. And so at some point he's convinced that he will die from whatever he's gotten. He doesn't know exactly what he's gotten. And as it turns out, he's not. He's going to just have to be an invalid taken care of by his mother for the rest of his life. So that's his version of hell, I suppose. Now, again, I should say spoilers. Part of the reason he gets sick is because he decided at one point that he was going to be a social revolutionary. So here's what he did. He got a job at a local dairy farm, and the reason he did that was because there were a whole bunch of black men who were employed on this dairy farm, and he thought he was going to play savior. So he was going to join the ranks of the workers and tell them all about how they should be fighting for their own liberation and, casting off the yoke of the man, et cetera, et cetera. And so he was actively encouraging them to break all the rules of the dairy. So one day, he decides that right as they're finishing up milking all the cows, he's going to light up a cigarette and share it with all the other guys. And, there's a big non-smoking sign right there. And so the other workers are kind of like, well, whatever. And I guess they have a drag or whatever it might be. And the next day they find out that all the milk had to be thrown out because now it smells like cigarettes. So then he tries this whole break the rules thing again. So he just goes ahead and kind of pours himself a glass of unpasteurized milk and drinks it. And the rest of the workers are like, no way, we're not following you there. As it turns out, that's how he gets sick. The point of Flannery O'Connor's story, well, there is no point because, as she will say many, many times, the point is actually to tell the story itself. So she's not trying to make an ethical point. But if you were to parse the enduring chill for ethical significance, what you would find is that there are reasons for rules. They're not arbitrary. They're not, just someone trying to interfere with your life and ruin your fun. And that is sometimes the way we see the rules, right? If I could only go 80 on this freeway, but somebody is preventing me from fully experiencing Fahrvergnügen. Someone is interfering with my fun by not letting me do X, Y, or Z. This is actually a very childish way to look at rules, by the way. But this is a temptation for us, is that rules is simply someone else interfering with my freedom. And we'll look more at that conception in a little bit. But natural law encourages us to take a different perspective, that the rules are actually for our well-being. And when we break them, there are going to be natural consequences, not because there's some kind of person standing there with a club wanting to punish us, right? God is sitting there with his lightning bolts waiting for us to step out of line, but the fact that simply there are natural consequences when we don't acknowledge the reality of the facts. And this leads me to talk about the difference between facts and values. So there were a whole slug of bad things that happened in the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is, in my mind, a mostly bad thing. Perhaps that's not quite fair. No, I shouldn't say sweeping things like that. But philosophically, there's a lot of missteps. And one of the missteps that happens, and a number of them are associated with this guy here on my left, Hume. David Hume was a philosopher who died in 1776, just as we were getting our act together over here in the colonies. And he was a skeptic, to say the least. And this applied not only to reality and what we might call the empirical sphere, but also equally, and perhaps even more so, to the moral sphere. And he has a very famous passage from his treatise on human nature, which, as he himself admits, fell stillborn from the press. Yes, it's that much of a page-turner. But here's a quotation that has inspired, I think, more comment than most any other philosophical passage, certainly in Hume and perhaps in any philosopher ever. And here's the quote. "I have always remarked," says Hume, "that the author," and this is any ethical author whatsoever really, "proceeds for some time in the ordinary way of reasoning, and establishes the being of a God, or makes observations concerning human affairs, when of a sudden I am surprised to find that instead of the usual copulations of propositions, is or is not, I meet with no proposition that is not now connected with an ought or an ought not. This change is imperceptible, but is, however, of the last consequence. For as this ought or ought not expresses some new relation or affirmation, 'tis necessary that it should be observed and explained." So here he is critiquing the fact that a lot of ethicists seem to talk about facts and then all of a sudden kind of slide into values. And this seems to Hume an illegitimate move. And to finish the quotation, "And at the same time that a reason should be given for what seems altogether inconceivable, how this new relation can be a deduction from others, which are entirely different from it. But as authors do not commonly use this precaution, I shall not presume to recommend it to the readers, but I am persuaded that this small attention would subvert all the vulgar systems of morality." And Hume's point here really is that what he thinks are all the missteps in all the ethical systems up to the point where he is writing. Of course, he's going to fix everything. This is what every philosopher says that they're going to do. Everything was a mess until me, but I'm going to make it all right. Hume does something to that effect, but he links all the other problems with this kind of move between fact and value. And this has become a kind of dichotomy, a dichotomy between facts and values, or is or ought. It's often referred to as the naturalistic fallacy. Now, this morning I'm going to argue that the naturalistic fallacy is anything but fallacious. It is a virtue. It is actually the right way to think about things. And I'm not sure I'm going to have to argue very hard, because the fact of the matter is that the facts should actually have some kind of bearing on what is actually the right thing to do, right? That only makes some kind of sense. So, although there is a distinction to be made between facts and values that we can agree on, I think, that to say that something exists or is a case is not yet to say that it is perhaps a good thing or a bad thing, that something's existence or its attributes do have an awful lot to say about whether it in fact is good or bad. And we do this in all sorts of very everyday humdrum ways, right? So I can say, gosh, this is a good desk. But this goodness is not a kind of free-floating quality. It has everything to do with the properties of the desk, right? Empirically, factually speaking. This is a good desk because it's a nice solid desk. It's at a good height. It's good to write on. It doesn't fall down. All these things help make this desk a good one. And this is the kind of connection that natural law theorists are likely to emphasize. So facts versus values, a distinction but not a separation, and we're going to take issue with folks like Hume. Now, what is natural law? I've been talking a lot about it, but I haven't actually given you a good definition. This is not necessarily good philosophical procedure, so I'm going to try to remedy this. First of all, let me introduce you to some big guns in the natural law area. First of all, there's our man, Thomas Aquinas. You recognize him? In the middle is Monsignor Robert Sokolowski. He's still at Catholic University of America. And he's been working with natural law for some time, has some really great things to say. In fact, you can find, just as a free PDF on the internet, his excellent excellent essay, What is Natural Law? I highly recommend it. In fact, I make my students read it. And then on the right is Jean Porter, who I will talk about a little bit and use her to a limited extent. I have a limited endorsement of her because I think she can be very good in many places. She tends to identify natural law too closely with revealed theology, which I do take issue with. And she's at Notre Dame right now. Big fan of Jean Porter, but don't necessarily follow her in all things and have some important disagreements with her. But she has a wonderful way of explaining natural law, which I will use, and I want to give her proper credit for that. So, if we're to understand natural law properly, we need a little metaphysics. I know that sounds scary, but it's actually not too complicated. So it basically goes something like this. Whenever something exists, it has a particular nature, its own character, its own set of essential attributes that it possesses as the particular kind of thing it is. So you'll never encounter a kind of amorphous, natureless, essenceless kind of thing. You'll always encounter, if something exists and you're able to discern that it exists, you're at the same time already going to have a kind of good idea of what it might be. Now, you might not know all that can be said about it. You might know only the general kind of thing it is, and it will be a great deal more investigation that will tell you something more specific. So you'll know that this is a plant or a flowering plant, but you won't know that it's an orchid, for instance. Not unless you've already met orchids in your life or have studied them in a botany class. And even that goo at the back of your refrigerator, goodness knows how it got there, but it seems to always appear. You may not have any really good idea what's in there, but you do know that, you may have some kind of inkling of what it might be. And you're pretty well convinced that you could put it under a microscope and discern a kind of molecular structure, right? So even the goo at the back of your refrigerator isn't, prima matter, completely unstructured. It too has a kind of character that can be analyzed chemically and physically. And this is the way of all reality, is that you don't have anything that exists without a particular nature. Now, the reason this is important for natural law is because if we're going to talk about something having a nature, we're already going to have a good idea of what is a good, what makes that thing good and what makes it bad. What is a good instance of that thing and a bad instance of that thing. So, to give you some very trivial examples. You have a plant in your home or office. How many of you have a green thumb? Nice. Okay. There are at least a couple people here. You can make up for the rest of us. I have a big brown thumb. I tend to kill living things, which is why I try not to buy them. How can you tell that you haven't been watering your plant in your home or office? Because it starts to look a little bit like, right? It starts to look pretty rough. And, thought I had a nice picture of that. That's probably later. So, you can tell that you have not been watering this plant, and you know that plants need water. How do we know all these things? Well, it's wrapped up with our knowledge that, this is what a healthy plant looks like, and here's what an unhealthy plant looks like, right? Actually, there's a very clever little Google commercial right now where there's, I think she must be Japanese. She's holding a succulent, and she's looking at the succulent kind of mournfully, and she says, "Google, show me the picture of a healthy succulent," and it comes up with a picture, and she says to the succulent, "Yeah, not us, bud." Because the thing she's holding is near dead, right? We can tell when something is healthy, it's a good version of itself, and, we can tell vice versa. So we know that, this is a wonderful, healthy golden retriever, very well trained, a good dog. And then we can encounter a dog that we know has mange and perhaps only has 3 legs and, has had a rough life. Now, this is actually what we mean by evil, and we'll talk about evil in just a second. But in general, the idea is that when we have a grasp of something's existence, we grasp what it is, and we also grasp its ends, its goodness, or its being in a deficient state of goodness. Well, this all comes to us all at once. So the idea that we have, in some sense, a world of pure facts devoid of value is a myth. It's a myth of, I don't want to put everything on the Enlightenment or on poor Hume, but it's certainly something that the Enlightenment and Hume definitely push forward in a certain way. Radical empiricists want to kind of say that all we get is kind of pure stimulation, right? We get patches of red and blue, and then somehow the mind's got to put it all together. Guess what? Our everyday experience gives us an awful lot more information than that. And within the information that we get on an ordinary, everyday human level is the kind of information about the goodness, inherent goodness of things, or their lack thereof. And this is really what natural law is getting at. So when we discover that something exists and we simultaneously apprehend its nature, we identify versions of good and bad, and therefore we immediately have a grasp, or maybe not immediately, but very generally speaking, we quickly come to understand what is a good or bad version of a thing and what's going to contribute to the goodness or lack of goodness of a particular thing. Right? So we know that plants deprived of sunlight or water tend to die. We need a certain amount of nutrition, both ourselves and our animals and plants. And in general, we can know even more when it comes to being human beings. We know, for instance, that even if we meet all of someone's physical needs, we also realize that there are important spiritual needs that people have, right? Friendship, love, beauty. All these things are grasped as we continue to just interact with things and understand what kinds of things they are. Now here we come to the question of evil, and there are many different kinds of evil. Aquinas actually uses, and the tradition in general, uses the word more broadly than we do. So we tend to think of moral evil, or the kind of evil that you will find in this scene from The Exorcist, which is my favorite scary movie. Part of it is, it's one of the few, I think, realistic scary movies, because I think Satan is real. I'm not necessarily so frightened of axe murderers or chainsaw massacres. But for Aquinas, evil is actually a broader category than something like the demonic or even moral evil in general. For Aquinas, evil, or malum in the Latin, can refer to badness of really any kind. Any instance, we might say, of a lack of a due or proper good would be referred to as evil. So, for instance, a cat having only 3 legs would be an evil, since lacking one of those legs is against the nature of a cat. The cat is, by nature, supposed to have 4 healthy limbs. On the other hand, a lack of a do-good, or what we might call a privation, in philosophical terminology, is not the same as any instance of absence whatsoever. So the fact that you can't flap your arms and fly up into the sky, well, that's not a defect for you, because that's not something that human beings have, right? So that would actually be kind of freaky. So rocks are not supposed to see, and if you encountered a rock that could see and talk to you, that would be really kind of disturbing. On the other hand, birds, with the exception of ostriches and penguins and things, are supposed to be able to fly. So if they have a broken wing or missing feathers, or for whatever reason are not able to fly, that would be considered evil, because that is a proper or do good for that particular kind of bird. So privation or evil is a lack of a due or proper good, and not just an absence of any kind. There are all sorts of things we can't do, and that doesn't mean that there's something deficient in us. Evil is not a positive reality as a result. It's a lack. So it's the kind of thing that depends on a pre-existing something or other, which itself is something that exists intrinsically, as a particular kind of substance. If that particular substance didn't exist, the attribute characteristic of that deficiency would also not exist. Evil is not something that can just wander around on its own. It is parasitic on the good. It's parasitic on what it is in. And this solved a problem that St. Augustine had when he was talking about the Manichaeans. He was actually really disturbed by this idea. In the Manichaeanism of his day and age, they were essentially dualists and talked about independent principles of good or evil. And it didn't make much sense to him, because what ended up happening was that God ended up being not the sole creator of the universe, but only the creator of good things, and then there was a creator of bad stuff. And he ended up being not omnipotent, but limited by this principle of evil. So there was this kind of eternal war. And so Augustine thought, trying to make evil a kind of independent thing simply makes nonsense of the very idea of God. How do we solve this problem? Well, we solve this problem by understanding that evil is not an independent something or other. It is something that always inheres as a kind of defect in something that otherwise is a positive reality. So the reality of evil is misunderstood if it is considered to be an independently existing thing. Evil is parasitic. It's a deficiency, an imperfection, the result of something missing. Now, natural evils is what I've really been talking about up until this point, and our dead plant would be an example of this. Also, basically the way the natural world works, tigers and lions hunting their prey, that kind of thing. Basically, physical harms that are built into the physical world are, broadly speaking, fall under the category of evil, but aren't supposed to be confused with the special category of moral evils, right? So we don't blame the plant because it's dying. In fact, if the plant's dying, the fault is probably ours. But we do end up with moral evil as a subset of evil in general when we start to talk about moral agents. So agents that have intelligence and thus freedom to choose or not choose. That's when we begin to talk about moral evil, when we have rational creatures responsible for their own choices. And Aquinas parses out this difference by talking about malum pene, which is loosely translated as fault or the evil of pain, versus malum culpae, the evil of fault or blame. In other words, he's talking about physical or natural evil versus moral evil. And we not only experience these two things differently, but they are quite different in fact. And one of the ways they're different in fact, for instance, is that for Aquinas, fault is much more serious. It's much more in the character of evil because, and this is a quotation, it corrupts our will, darkens our intellect, and can turn us into, actually this is me at the very end, can turn us into bad people. That's a little bit more, yeah, that's me. Aquinas is always a little bit more articulate than that. We can also say that when it comes to physical evil or natural evil, we can place that on God's doorstep, right? Because God made this whole physical order, and He's allowed this kind of thing to happen. But we can't blame Him for moral evils. That's on us, right? Now, God has permitted that to be the case because in allowing people to make free choices, the cost of freedom is to allow us to make mistakes. So God permits that sort of evil, but He's not the cause of it. We are. That goes back to us. But we can attribute kind of the overall order of things to God. In fact, we ought to. And therefore, regular natural physical evils are, in fact, God's fault. Although we should, I think, if we're taking the Psalms very seriously, praise Him for that rather than blame Him for that. Now, moral evils occur, right? A cat killer, is that the face of a killer? A cat chaser, maybe, but hey, who isn't? Now, moral evils occur when a good proper to a moral agent, and in particular, usually a moral agent's action, is missing. So one way of asking what makes actions good or bad is to ask, what is lacking from our moral action or our moral character or our moral decision that should in fact be there? And Aquinas is going to have a number of ways of answering this. He's going to talk about the actions in general, our intentions, the circumstances, and consequences as well. So there's a whole bunch of different ways in which we can evaluate our actions, the rightness or wrongness, the goodness or badness of those actions. Now, what we have in the past was an idea of law as an expression of rationality. This is essentially the idea that you will get in both Plato and Aristotle. But by the time you get to the early modern period, you have a sort of switch that really emphasizes law as an expression of will. And by that, we're really talking about a reflection of what the person in charge wants. That's kind of the overarching model of law in a lot of quarters during the early modern and late modern period. So a slow and steady shift in the way laws and moral precepts were viewed. And the idea was that the authority or opinion of a particular set of lawmakers was essentially encoded in the law. Law's purpose in promoting a common good and therefore being an expression of reason or an expression of something that would actually encourage citizens to be truly good and virtuous was minimized, and instead we had this idea of laws as an imposing of will, and therefore a restriction on the freedoms of those who were forced to follow the laws. So we have this idea that law is constantly curtailing my freedom, and I'd rather really not have it, but by virtue of necessity, sometimes we have to have laws. As a result, laws get to be viewed as a kind of arbitration among persons and their competing freedoms. And that's really what we have, I think, in our cultural consciousness right now, is you have freedoms and you have freedoms and you have freedoms, and sometimes they conflict. Okay, we need a law for that. The idea would be that if your freedoms never conflicted, we wouldn't need a law. This is not the classical conception of a law. A law was actually something that would ordain things to the common good. So it was a way of the lawgiver simply discerning what the common good required and how it could be promoted on a grand scale. Now, the way that St. Thomas is going to express that, he's going to give us 4 little attributes for law, and I basically make my students memorize this every semester that I teach ethics. It is an ordinance of reason for the common good, made by him who has the care of the community and promulgated. So the 4 elements are, it's a precept of reason. So again, it's not so much that this is something that the lawgiver arbitrarily wants, but this is something that the lawgiver foresees is needed in order to promote the common good of a community. And therefore, for the common good goes hand in hand with this idea of a precept of reason. That reason is actually looking toward what is needed for the entire community to thrive, right? So we, again, remember the good or the natural end of something is something thriving, being its best, being a healthy, good version of what it's supposed to be. In this case, the city or nation or political community is supposed to thrive, and it's the reason of the lawgiver that will discern what is needed for that to happen. That lawgiver should be a legitimate authority. First of all, not everyone should or could make laws that people will follow. And then promulgate it. So if you expect people to follow the law, you've got to publish the law. In this case, we have to say ignorance of the law is a very good excuse. So, in other words, for St. Thomas, law is not an expression of will, but an expression of reason. The duly appointed lawgiver recognizes the steps needed for the common good and then enacts laws to achieve these. It's not an expression of that lawgiver's preferences, but of what is required for the authentic good of the community which he has care of. Now, there are a whole lot of different kinds of law that St. Thomas identifies. There is very obviously human or positive laws, right? These are the laws that have been made by a particular society or community, the laws on the books. Not too hard, right? We then have divine law. This is the law promulgated through divine revelation. So think here of Scripture, or Scripture and tradition. Then we have the eternal law. The eternal law is often confused with the divine law, but it's really something distinct. So think of it as divine providence, as God's providential care of the entire world, the result of God's ruling the universe and creating it with an order and a purpose. And then we have the natural law. Natural laws are those laws which we recognize as true simply because of what things are. Our knowledge of natural law is based on our capacity to understand reality through reason because we are rational beings. And so St. Thomas will actually define natural law as basically the rational creature's participation in eternal law. We see the divine order, the divine governance, as it is hardwired into the nature of things and the structure of the world around us. The other way that St. Thomas puts it is the law written in the hearts of men is the natural law. Now, this natural law is not something that we need God to tell us especially about, although St. Thomas will say that he thinks something like the Ten Commandments is actually just a divine affirmation of what we could otherwise discover on our own. But for those of you who have read the first question of the Summa, you'll realize that, of course, it's useful for us to hear things articulated in divine revelation that we could possibly know without divine revelation. Why? Because we'd need a long time to figure it out. We do so with great difficulty. Only a small portion of us would have the leisure time to do that, and we'd still make a lot of mistakes, right? So we do have a reiteration in Scripture, even with aspects of divine law. But in general, divine law, natural law, pardon me, don't want to confuse you. Natural law is something that we are able to discern on our own. And if you think that I'm making this up, you can just look to, for instance, St. Paul in the letter to the Romans. He says, for instance, for when the Gentiles who do not have the law, and the law here is the Scripture or divine revelation to Israel, observe the prescriptions of the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the demands of the law are written in their hearts. So there's still an idea that even if they haven't gotten moral precepts revealed to them, the Gentile nations, they're still responsible because they should know it anyway, because it should be written in their hearts. This has been viewed by the tradition as an articulation of the idea of the natural knowability of the eternal law, which is to say the natural law. Wherefore, says St. Thomas, the rational creature has a share of the eternal reason, whereby it has a natural inclination to its proper act and end. And this participation of the eternal law in the rational creature is called the natural law. So the idea is that everything participates in eternal law, right? Because everything has a God-given nature. So everything does, if God ordains it, we're going to do it. That's just the way things are. But things do it in their own proper fashion. So irrational creatures who don't have the freedom and reason that we do are going to follow it because of how they are biologically or because of instinct or what have you. We follow it with our rationality. So we have a special share in eternal law, and natural law is how we sum that up. Natural law is basically our insight into eternal law. Not only with regard to the universe in general, but also specifically with regard to what actually is good for our own nature. So we have an understanding of what will work or will not work for human beings. Now, last time, I had actually planned to talk a little bit about this in our canceled third lecture, unfortunately. So this is part of the impossible hill we're climbing. There are many different ways in which we're able to apprehend the good. So, when we talk about the natural law, it's easy for us to think that this is the kind of thing that we're simply thinking really, really hard about life, right? And that's not untrue. That is, there is a role for rational reflection. But what we reflect on are not simply the facts, but our experience of the facts, which actually include a very specific way that we apprehend the good in our own lives. And I want to talk about the ways in which that good is apprehended. First of all, we have a kind of sensible appetite. Certainly chocolate cake is a good example of our sensible appetite. I also include books because that's almost a sensible appetite sort of thing for Dominican friars. We love books. Sometimes I introduce myself and say, hello, I'm Father Justin, and I'm a recovering bookaholic. You know, it says, hi, Father Justin. So human beings, like every other animal created by God, are drawn to things outside of us that can be considered good. And for Aquinas, our appetites and desires really follow on our mode of apprehension. So, we can see this actually in the natural world. At the very lowest level, there is a kind of basic desire or appetition that attaches to the most basic types of apprehension. So, you think of, for instance, the little amoeba, and the little amoeba doesn't have a whole lot going on, except it has some kind of bare ability to encounter stimuli in its environment, right? And insofar as that stimuli is painful, it goes and tries to swim away. My biology here is not very good, but you'll get my point. Or it encounters something pleasant, right? Something that is remotely food-like, and it swims after it. So, based on our mode of apprehension of reality around us, automatically comes our mode of appetite or desire. Now, human beings have a lot more going for us, despite all our limitations and flaws, than an amoeba. And so we have not only sensible appetite, but also an intellectual appetite. And St. Thomas talks about, and again, these are correlated to our senses versus our intellect. And the latter, our intellectual appetite, is exactly what St. Thomas refers to as will. Now, sensory appetite can have negative connotations, but in Aquinas it does not. It actually is a very good thing. It is our first and kind of most immediate way of being attracted to goods. Now, sometimes these goods are truly good for us, and sometimes they're not so truly good for us. And this is the nature of sensible appetite, as we go after things that are, we could say, broadly speaking, under the characteristics of pleasant or yummy. But what is pleasant or yummy isn't always truly good for us, right? So we have that extra slice of chocolate cake, and then we hold our stomachs at the end of Thanksgiving dinner for an extra hour and say, why did I eat that? That kind of thing. So what we apprehend is always under the aspect of good, and the Latin phrase that you can trot out at parties is sub ratione boni. We always apprehend and pursue something under the aspect of good. Insofar as it's desirable, that's why we go after it. But that doesn't mean it's good in every respect. And sometimes the immediate goodness, that which captures us most powerfully on a sensible level, is actually what ends up attracting us to something that on the long-term, fully understood level, if we were to use our smarts and our intellect, we'd realize that it's not, in fact, the best thing for us. So instead of staying up late, we really should be going to bed, that kind of thing. Now, how many of you can pick out 3 or 4 that you're feeling right now? Our emotional life is very important for St. Thomas, and we talked a little bit about that in the second lecture. The idea is that there's a lot of information that comes to us through our emotional life. How are we doing? What, generally speaking, is my situation right now? Emotions like fear or joy or sorrow or depression or disgust. All these things can tell us, very generally speaking, how things are going with us and what things are like in our immediate vicinity. So it can as it were, give us a whole lot of very non-specific information about how we're doing. Emotions have a very important connection to the objects that we desire. So St. Thomas will actually parse out the different emotions relative to whether we're talking about things that we're enjoying or pursuing or that we're struggling to pursue. But in general, emotions have both a cognitive dimension and a sensible dimension. So there is a kind of physical change in you even as you are encountering something that's triggering that emotion and to which that emotion is related, right? So there is something fearful, either in idea or perhaps in reality, that's also getting your heart racing, right? If you didn't have the heart racing and the I don't know what I'm going to do and the nervous sweat, you probably wouldn't describe yourself as being fearful. On the other hand, you don't just have the heart palpitations for no reason, right? So these two things all go together. And emotions are very useful because they can tell us what something is right or something is wrong. So it's also, emotions actually also do magnetize us to practical realities and perhaps avenues of action. So we have concupiscible emotions, and those are emotions which basically help us to pursue the immediate good or avoid what is immediately bad. So St. Thomas will parse this out into 6 emotions. Love and hate, which is just kind of this simple idea of something, of our relationship between something good or something evil. Desire and aversion, that is, are we actually pursuing the good or the evil? And joy and sorrow, that is, after we've obtained the good or lost the good and have to live with the evil. These are the emotions that we experience. And he will always put the emphasis on the good. So now good naturally precedes evil, since evil is the privation of good, right? We already talked about this. Wherefore all the passions, that is, all our emotions, the object of which is good, are naturally before those the object of which is evil, because the quest of a good is the reason for shunning the opposite evil. So that's how St. Thomas will relate the two aspects or those opposed emotions. We also have what are called the irascible emotions. These are those aggressive emotions that we trot out when we are facing difficulty in our life, when we are trying to overcome obstacles to those good things that we want. So, and again, we tend to have these in pairs. So we have hope and despair, confidence or fear, and then we have kind of one emotion that exists by itself, anger. And I could give you an entire lecture on anger because St. Thomas has a really good treatment of it. And anger is something that we don't necessarily have a very functional relationship with in our current society. Mostly everyone believes that you ought not to be angry. And if you look angry, then there's something wrong. And we should be very suspicious of angry people. Sometimes you should be angry. And if you don't get angry in inappropriate ways, that actually can mean that something's the matter with you. So in any case, I won't go on this topic, but some very interesting things that St. Thomas has to say about anger. And the idea, again, is that the passions of the irascible faculty stand between those are the concupiscible passions that denote movement towards good or evil, and those concupiscible passions that denote rest in good or evil. So between wanting something and having something, the irascible emotions take charge and help us get it. And it is therefore evident the irascible passions both arise from and terminate in the passions of the concupiscible faculty. So the fact of the matter is that all those irascible emotions like hope and despair, confidence, fear, and anger don't arise if you don't want anything. Which was, for instance, the Stoics were really into that. You know, if you don't want anything, then you won't experience any of these pains or any of these emotions, and you'll have, inner peace. I'm not sure it was quite that simple, and it never quite worked out that way, but it was a good idea. So, and what I've already kind of emphasized, but I think is important to note, and we talked a little bit about it last time, was the fact that emotions can be painted as something irrational or unhelpful. And I want to say that both of those statements are untrue. There's a kind of reasonability, rationality to the emotions, because the emotions can give us very important, if very vague, information. And that part of the challenge is to train those emotions to actually work for us. And here's the little chariot and horses. So if you've read Plato, this is his idea of the soul. So reason is our charioteer and is supposed to be using and guiding the horses, which are our emotions. Human will, as I already mentioned, is that power of desiring which arises from our intellectual apprehension. So insofar as we apprehend the good as understood, not just as sensibly present to us, but as understood on an intellectual level, we have an intellectual appetite, and that is the human will. And although our will is drawn to things only insofar as they are understood as good, this again doesn't mean that they always are completely or truly good for us. So we can make some mistakes here. The will always follows on a certain amount of intellectual apprehension. So if we didn't have an intellect, we would not have a will. We would be a lot more like animals in the sense that if something sensibly good appears to us, we would kind of naturally follow our instincts and go for it. And it's only because we have an ability to understand that we have an ability to step back and say, okay, do I really want this or not? Is this good for, the long term? Is this good not only for me but for my community? That kind of thing. And this is where our voluntary action and free choice comes from. So, because we act from judgment, because we have an apprehensive power that judges something should be sought or avoided, because we have these kinds of judgment, we are able to go beyond natural instinct to act in accord with reason. And therefore, we have a freedom of judgment and a power of being inclined to various things beyond the purely sensible. We can do things voluntarily, and we can exercise deliberate choice. So human freedom really resides in the fact that we have will and intellect. Will requires that we know something beforehand, and it requires that we know what is good, right? Or able to make distinctions among goods and choose something that's preferable to another thing. When we choose in accordance with what we know is good or right, we act freely. And only man is capable of these kinds of free acts. So the idea is that this sets us apart from really virtually everything else that we encounter in our ordinary life. But the intellect does not always determine the will. So as it turns out, the intellect won't give us every single bit of piece of information that we need. So sometimes we'll still have some perfectly good choices. You may have heard of the example of Buridan's ass. Buridan was it sounds like I'm cussing, but I'm really not. So Buridan, who was a late medieval philosopher, John Buridan had this example of a donkey. And he would place two piles of hay or two apples or whatever that were equidistant from the donkey and equally good and equally shaped and pretty much indistinguishable. And Buridan's question was, would the donkey just kind of lay down and die because it couldn't choose between the two? Now we know for ourselves that doesn't happen to us, right? So we're able to still make choices even when our intellect basically isn't able to make the final decision. There's no reason for us to prefer this pile of hay to that pile of hay, right? It's a little bit more complicated for our lives, but the kind of bottom line for us is that we have a lot of options, and sometimes there's no clear winner, in which case we still have the power to say, okay, I want something and I'm going to choose you. So the will is underdetermined by the intellect, but that doesn't make our action any less free. Now the idea, of course, is that after we do all this understanding and deciding, we still have the basic facts of reality to contend with. So what we want and the way things are ought to be meeting, at least ideally, if we're acting rightly and in a good fashion. And if we don't, we have a kind of violation of the natural law. In other words, we have a contrast or conflict between natural ends, the natures of things, and our own human purposes, our own human desires and wants. And we actually see that when this conflict occurs, bad things happen all the time. So here I'm not referring to kind of the massive suicides at the end of Antigone so much as I'm referring to kind of everyday consequences of our actions. So what happens when we don't respect the integrity of the environment and we pollute in order to basically live the lifestyle that we want? Bad things happen to the environment. So we have things like pollution. When we don't respect the nature of our communities or the integrity of our marriage, and we act against that, sometimes our marriage or our community will survive the violation, but oftentimes it will not. There's a kind of natural integrity, a kind of natural order that we either are going to act in accord with and therefore promote through our action, or we're going to work against and we're going to end up destroying through our actions. This is simply one, but a very important illustration of the natural law. There is an order, a rationality, and an integrity to things that must be respected. Now, within natural law, there are primary and secondary precepts. So primary precepts of natural law tend to be on a very general level and apply across the board. It begins with the precept, do good and avoid evil. Right? Brothers say this to each other all the time. When you're leaving the priory, the prior will yell after you, do good and avoid evil. It's really hard to violate that one, right, because it's so general. Now, you combine that with a basic knowledge of the nature of things around you, and especially our own human nature, and you actually come out with some immediate consequences and some more concrete precepts of the natural law. A lot of these primary precepts are a result of our inherent inclinations. So remember our appetites, both intellectual and sensible. A lot of those appetites flow from who we are, and living them and understanding that they orient us to good things, but sometimes can get sidetracked to things that aren't truly good. We understand what is in fact good for us or not. And when we follow that goodness, we're actually understanding something of the precepts of natural law that apply to us. Now again, the most important part of natural law is not to get confused by the word natural, because what we can sometimes think of as natural as being not artificial. But the idea that natural here is what we might call perfective, right? If I'm following natural law, then I am promoting the true and authentic well-being of myself and hopefully those around me. And sometimes I will encounter a situation in which those my individual good and the common good might be in slight conflict. And so sometimes I give up my individual good for the common good. But the idea is that whenever I'm acting for or in accord with natural law, I'm always promoting the well-being of myself, my community, and the world around me. So natural here should be thought of in terms of fulfilling or benefiting or perfecting, right? Not as opposed to artificial. And so when again, those precepts of natural law are something that I am able to reflect on just in terms of my natural inclinations to what perfects my existence. Now again, as I mentioned, natural law is fairly straightforward when it comes to these primary precepts. And again, primary precepts would be very close to the kinds of things that you'll get in the Ten Commandments. Secondary precepts are when you start to make them even more concrete, and that's an awful lot more complicated. It can get pretty tricky, again, to identify, is this an instance of theft or murder or adultery, that kind of thing. And it is in reflecting on our natural instincts towards what perfects us that helps really flesh out this idea of the precepts. So I realize that my intellect naturally is fulfilled by its orientation toward truth. Truth is what my intellect aims at, and therefore it is that natural good which is part of the natural law for me. Again, my stomach tells me that I should eat periodically, right? And failing to do so would violate a needed good and therefore the natural law as it applies to me. Now, it gets complicated when we get, again, more and more specific and when we start applying the principles of natural law to particular situations. This is one of the reasons why we need human laws. Nope, let me go back. And a lot of these human laws will be a combination of natural law, that is talking about something that's naturally perfecting, but also a combination of custom and something that's a little bit more arbitrary and changeable. One of the examples I often give is traffic laws. So making sure that we all don't drive on the same side of the road going from opposite directions is pretty important. And there could be something kind of natural and essential about that because, as we know, if we all drove on the same side of the road going both directions, we would get nowhere. We just have a whole lot of head-on collisions. So it's important that, people going in one direction pick one side and people going the other direction pick another side. Which is the right side to pick? Well, I already gave it away. The right side. So the British are crazy. No, just kidding. We could easily drive on the left side, and people do, and who cares? Much smaller part of the world drives on the left side, interestingly enough. So which side of the road we pick, relatively arbitrary. But that we pick a side of the road and that we keep people safe on the road, well, that seems to be a pretty direct consequence of natural law and promoting people's life and safety. We could also talk about particular punishments for people, right? So we know that the punishment for murder should probably be more severe than the punishment for theft, but to assign a particular numerical value of years to murder is largely arbitrary and a function of convention. So should it be 25 years? Should it be 30 years? Should it be lifetime? When should people be paroled? All these things are the nitty-gritty, which natural law does not necessarily answer for us. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the way that laws are made, or rather the ways that laws are interpreted. So one of the things that both Aristotle and Aquinas will be very clear on is that when it comes to laws, no matter how good, no matter how prescient your lawgiver is, he's never going to be able to give you a code that is absolutely 100% exhaustive. Right? There are always going to be circumstances that are unforeseen. So the best that laws can do is foresee typical circumstances and articulate general principles and procedures. It is therefore essential that at the end of the day, we have, in addition to just laws, we have wise and just judges to apply those laws. Now, how should these laws be applied? I'm not going to go into great detail about this because this really goes beyond the scope of my talk and my expertise. But I will simply point out that judges and lawgivers are meant to have two distinct roles. And even if they are interrelated, we ought to keep them distinct. And we can't do without one or the other. Now let's talk a little bit about judges because I think the lawgiver is more or less, at least on an abstract level, clear to us. The judge has the power to apply or interpret the law, but not to make the law, right? So the judge should not effectively or de facto construct or strike down laws. The judge, if that judge were to do so, would be functioning as a lawmaker. Or to use the parlance from our own American political system, what would end up happening is the judiciary branch would become effectively the executive branch. Now, you might ask, well, doesn't the Supreme Court do this all the time? Not really. It only does it in a very particular way. It rules that certain laws or ordinances are unconstitutional. That is, it abrogates one law by pointing out that it is in conflict with another more important and fundamental law. In this case, for the Supreme Court, usually the U.S. Constitution, which is the most fundamental set of laws of all, at least for us. That being said, the laws, at least by themselves, and this goes as much for the Constitution as it does for local ordinances or tax codes, laws do not interpret themselves. And so there must be a larger context of interpretation that must be honored. And again, though we can't go too much into this, suffice it to say that this area where legal precedent and an overall understanding of natural law and the authentic good comes in, they have to work together to interpret the laws. Our ultimate understanding of what it means to be a human being and what is the authentic good of individuals and the community must form a part of the background of our interpretation of law. And to deny that, I think, is just to deny the obvious. Oops. So virtues, let's talk a little bit about virtues, and this will be where we need to stop. Virtues are a habit or disposition in virtue of which we can act well. Now, it's tempting to think of virtues as simply good habits, and therefore they become something like getting into the habit of brushing your teeth every night. But a better analogy is actually a skill. So a skill allows us to do a particular activity well, with ease, and with a good deal of satisfaction or pleasure. So we might think of sports or playing instruments or speaking languages as better analogs for virtues than simply brushing your teeth at night. Virtues also have the effect of bringing our emotions into conformity with our will. So when we are virtuous, our emotions have undergone a certain kind of training. In the case of courage, for instance, our fearfulness works with our reason, not against it. And I probably already told you about, the horror movie. The courageous person is the guy who's going to, or girl, who's going to basically survive the axe murderer, right? If you are courageous, you're getting your fearful feelings to actually work with your reason, not against it. If you are not courageous, you're going to end up either being too fearful, and therefore you're going to end up cowering in the corner where the axe murderer is going to get you, or you're going to be so rash that you say, hey, let's just go seek that axe murderer out, go run into the woods and see if we can find him. And that's also a great way to die in the opening sequence. So if you want to survive to the end of the horror movie, then you want to have courage. This is essentially a classical understanding of what virtues we're supposed to be able to do for us, is that the temperate, courageous, just, prudent person would have these virtues that would allow their emotions to correspond to the reality of the situation, and therefore they would do the right thing. And vices, of course, are the opposite to virtues. So whenever we choose to act in a certain way, and that way is good, we inculcate a virtue, and simultaneously when we self-reflectively and with knowledge choose to do something that we know to be not good, we will inculcate that virtue in us, the opposite of that virtue in us, and we will become vicious people. And eventually those vices will make certain kinds of bad activities second nature for us, just the way virtues make good activities second nature in us. I already mentioned that Aquinas will not only talk about virtues and vices, but also give us some very definite criteria for evaluating good and evil in human acts. So, and there are a lot of ways to get things wrong. So we can do the wrong kind of thing. Aquinas is going to say that there are certain kinds of acts that we just cannot do and make them good. So murder, adultery, things like lying, things like that are just going to be off the table. There's no good lying, there's no good murder. There might be justified killing, but murder is always off the table. There's no good adultery, that kind of thing. We've got to get the kind of thing that we're doing right. We have to have reasonably good intentions. So if you're doing a good thing for a bad reason, that's going to make the act overall bad. Not as bad as doing a bad thing for a bad reason, but still not there. He's also going to say, look, your consequences should be good, so you should be giving some thought as to how it's all going to play out. So when it comes to laws, for instance, must we obey unjust laws? Well, not the way we have to obey just laws, but St. Thomas is also going to say that overthrowing any law, even if it's unjust, has a cost. And what we need to actually ask ourselves is is living with the injustice better than overthrowing the unjust law if we understand the kinds of consequences. That is, if we're going to rectify the legal code while at the same time destroying the society that we're in and killing millions of people in almost endless war, is that worth it? Aquinas is going to give us the common sense answer, no. So we're going to have to look at everything to see whether it's something that we should actually do. This is a general principle for St. Thomas, is we ought to not only say we should do the right thing for the right reason, but we should do it with the idea that it won't cause great destruction, that it will actually result in good effects. And we should do it in the right way, in the right time, in the right place, and so on. So, for instance, if I'm correcting a brother, it's very good that I do that if it's something that they need correcting on, but I should not do it in front of other brothers or when I am very angry. But as a superior of my community, I ought to take them aside and do it in the right way that will allow the brother to feel loved and cared for rather than criticized and torn down. These are the kinds of things that Aquinas is talking about. So I think of a good action is rather difficult because you have to get a lot of things right. It's a little bit like trying to skate a perfect program rather than simply trying to do the right thing. It can be a very complicated sort of thing. There are a lot of different aspects that we have to look at. The other analogy that is often used is one of a bullseye. There is one spot for the bullseye. So there is one way to get it right. There's a lot of ways to get it wrong, right? Which isn't to say that it's all equal, right? So not having all the best consequences or not doing it in the right place at the right time is not as serious as doing the wrong thing altogether, right? Okay, so freedom of indifference and freedom of excellence. Serveus Pinckaers talks about the fact that if we understand virtue and vice, we're going to understand our freedom in a different way. So right now, the popular understanding of freedom basically is that we have the ability to choose, right? We have two roads in a wood, and we can choose either one. Robert Frost recommends that we go along the road less traveled. But in any case, we like our ability to choose, and that becomes our paradigm for freedom, is having options. Now, again, if we have a more sophisticated understanding of what our freedom entails and the role that virtue plays in our life, we're likely not to have this idea of freedom of indifference, but of freedom for excellence. When our freedom is exercised correctly, we choose actions in keeping with our human dignity and what is authentically good, and our freedom grows. Freedom is not a static capacity to choose, although that is a precondition for our freedom, but it's a dynamic ability to orient our entire lives. Pure freedom or freedom of indifference is actually a conceptual fiction. The more we choose the good, the more we're magnetized to it. And sadly, the more we choose bad things, the more we're magnetized to those as well. And you can ask any addict about this particular truth of life. Choosing what is truly good becomes easier, more pleasant, and helps us become better versions of ourselves. In other words, we develop virtues that make our choice of what is truly good for us second nature. So exercising our freedom is a lot less than choosing between those two roads in a wood, and more like, again, learning a language or a sport or mastering a musical instrument or becoming an artist or a scholar. And this is why I have Michael Phelps and Ella Fitzgerald as my paragons for freedom. You can also contrast, for instance, your master pianist with the child who just kind of goes up to the piano and starts clanking on it, right? Both of them have complete freedom to basically push down whatever keys they want, right? But which has the most authentic freedom? Well, you would say the pianist, right? Because the pianist knows how to create beautiful things, and if the pianist is going to violate the rules of piano playing, they will know how to do that in a way that is truly constructive and excellent. Whereas the child can really not go far beyond the clanking on the keys, at least not yet. So when it comes to our freedom, there is train or growth. But once that learning or training occurs, there is incredible delight and incredible freedom. Now, if we think of freedom in these terms, then we probably are not going to find our current vision of law and freedom quite so compelling. And we're not going to think of laws perhaps so much on the paradigm of, hey, we have to have a referee amongst our unmitigated freedoms to choose, right? We have to have someone to say, okay, you traveled, or you flag on the play, or basically a traffic cop who says, okay, now you get to go through the intersection, but you got to stay there. Rather, we have an idea of laws that actually contribute to all of our common flourishing and the common flourishing of our entire community. Now, I want to connect this with some of our myths of the public forum. Again, if we think of our freedom as one of sheer indifference, and therefore we think of law as a referee, we're likely to think of the public forum as a neutral space. That is, we simply each have our own viewpoint that is independent of another's viewpoint. And if we're going to be fair, none of us are going to presuppose anything. We're going to meet in a completely value-neutral area where we all get to argue completely different things. This is a really bad way of thinking of the public space, and it's actually impossible, because the public space is never value-neutral, and it is never, as some people seem inclined to think, virtually atheistic. We must remember that everyone has their set of values, whether they admit to it or not. And that if we're talking about a belief in God that contributes to our ethical discourse, even atheism or agnosticism is an actual position just as much as theism. And in fact, if we're going to talk about something that was the neutral position, we might be more inclined to say that being theistic is the neutral position. There are, after all, more theists in the world than any others, and there was, at least in the tradition, the idea that people could know that God exists regardless of any kind of faith background. So even people who had no revealed scriptures of their own could know that God existed by reason. So so God was considered actually a part of the natural law, something that we could all come to an understanding of. So when it comes to our debates, we want to be fair, but we also want to realize when other people aren't being fair, and we want to actually perhaps look behind what people are saying in a debate society, beyond the you're right, you're wrong, and perhaps question or agree or dig deeper into the conceptions of the human person and the idea of natural law underlying particular discussions in the public forum. And this is perhaps a very useful way of coming at debate rather than simply a yelling match, which seems to characterize our public discourse more and more. I wanted to return to one of our initial themes, which is rights. So natural law, I believe, is the only way that we can really clarify the idea of human rights. And on the left, you have Jacques Maritain, one of the great Thomists of the 20th century. He is, as I mentioned, one of the architects of the UN's Declaration on Human Rights. And here's how he puts the linkage between natural law and human rights. He says, quote, "The human person possesses rights because of the very fact that he is a person." And please excuse the using of the male pronoun. We, of course, mean this to be inclusive for women as well. He is a person, a whole, master of himself or herself and his acts, and who consequently is not merely a means to an end, but an end who must be treated as such. The dignity of the human person, the expression means nothing if it does not signify that by virtue of natural law, the human person has the right to be respected, is the subject of rights, possesses rights. There are things which are owed to man or woman because of the very fact that he is man. The true philosophy of the rights of the human person is therefore based upon the idea of natural law. The same natural law which lays down our most fundamental duties, and by virtue of which every law is binding, is the very law which assigns to us our fundamental rights. And that's from The Rights of Man in Natural Law. And this is how we make sense of rights language. First of all, this is how we talk about where rights come from, right? They're not sui generis, but they actually are based on who and what we are as human beings. And second of all, this is how we are able to adjudicate differences among rights, or how we are able to prioritize one person's rights to others, right? So, for instance, the right to freedom of expression is very important, but in certain cases, it takes a backseat to the right to life. So, am I allowed to run into a crowded movie theater and scream fire? No, I'm not. In fact, I'd be legally liable for that, and rightly so, because my freedom of expression, my freedom to do that, is not more important than people's freedom to not be trampled to death. We could also say that my freedom to actualize my own potentiality to be CEO does not justify my cutting corners in my corporate endeavors, cutting costs and so dumping toxic waste in a nearby town that will give countless people cancer and other assorted diseases. This is not okay behavior, because their right to physical well-being and life is much more important than to my right to climb the corporate ladder. These are the kinds of things that we're able to adjudicate when we understand where those rights come from. And here's where I have to sidestep all of grace and sin. And that's good. It gives us something to do on Saturdays in the spring. So let us simply close with a prayer, and then we'll have at least 20 minutes for questions. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. O God, grant that whatever good things I have, I may share generously with those who have not, and that whatever good things I do not have, I may request humbly from those who do. Plant deep in me, Lord, all the virtues, that I might be devout in divine matters, discerning in human affairs, and burdensome to no one in fulfilling my own bodily needs. Order me inwardly through a good life, that I might do what is right and what will be meritorious for me and a good example for others. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Okay, so questions. A lot of things that... Okay, good. I always like that. Great. Yeah, Bob.
Let me just pass you the mic, and I'll just ask for those who use the mic, make sure you hold it steadily, about 6 to 8 inches away. We'll be fine. Thanks.
Father Justin, all your references to Aquinas in this lecture, were they from the Summa Theologica?
That's right, although he talks about natural law in many other places, but the Summa is a great place to start, and he gives very clear. So specifically, he talks about law and natural law in the Summa Theologia Prima Secundae, questions 90 through 97. That's a big portion of where he talks about natural law. But natural law also comes in both the Prima Secundae and Secunda Secundae, where he talks about virtue in general and then the specific virtues. So natural law kind of pervades all of that. I've been teaching this for a while, so.
So it seems that you can't have a discussion with someone that doesn't at least agree with natural law. So how would you go about helping someone understand that there is natural law to start a discussion?
That is a great question. Well, it really depends on where you part ways, right, where the breakdown happens. So, for instance, when I was in college, I had a very interesting discussion from an Israeli who was basically had turned atheist. And you would think we had no common ground, and we probably had very little common ground at the very beginning. But I realized very shortly that he actually had a sense that everything was kind of relative and subjective. So we had to do a lot of talking about, is there an objective reality? Is there a reality that we all can face? Is there a shared world that we have? And actually getting through that hurdle ended up being a big breakthrough, to talk about other things. So it really depends on where the breakdown is. A lot of people can, talk about the human person, but have a very different conception of what the human being is. So they can have a sense of our rationality is not very important at all. And so then we have to have a discussion about what rationality and intelligence is. And some of it has to do with the fact that they have a very different conception of intelligence that's much more curtailed based on basically an enlightenment or post-enlightenment understanding of rationality or reason as kind of calculative and very constrained to kind of a narrow empirical sort of reality. So it really depends on where you part ways. So a lot of it is listening and hearing what they have to say. And as I've mentioned many, many times, a lot of people's difficulties with a particular issue is not on the intellectual level. It's they're dealing with something in their own life. And so being able to talk about that and make sense of that, having someone to listen to them on that level actually helps them to appreciate something that they were initially closed to. So that's been my experience.
We'll go back here first.
Thank you, Father. With the rise of the nuns and the NONES,
Right.
yes, unfortunately not the NUNS. Well, some orders. With the rise of the nuns, and with our kind of the general from the Pew Research, the general kind of people defining themselves as being religious is on the decline. Where do you see our society, particularly as influenced through our laws and public policy, kind of going, since we are getting farther and farther away from an understanding of the natural law and the intent of that human law or positive law?
That is a great and very complicated question. This is one of the reasons why I actually talk about natural law, because I think natural law is actually one of the ways in which we can reconnect people to the tradition and to the most fundamental values of the Christian, the Judeo-Christian tradition. The fact of the matter is that there probably was a time in which you could kind of thump your Bible and proof text somebody, and that was good enough. But that again assumed that you had a kind of shared religious heritage. When you have people who are largely agnostic and who are, in some sense, rejecting Christian revelation and Christian doctrine, it is actually very nice to be able to say, okay, well, we don't need that. We can talk, well, at least not yet. I'm not saying revelation is dispensable, but we can go back a few steps and we can talk about our experiences, about being human, and we can talk about what it means to be human. And we can see what kind of implications that has for our behavior, our values, and what kind of political commitments we should be making. This is not, obviously, a quick and easy conversation. This is basically developing permanent intellectual enterprises and shared relationships with people. So one of the things that I think would help turn our country around from, I think, was what has been a very noticeable decline in values all the way across the board, from family to, even our educational system has become a kind of capitalist enterprise. I think we have to engage in a level of personal and public discourse, which really tries to pursue the truth together. And I think if we do that, the truth will come out and the truth will set us free. That might sound simplistic, and I don't mean it. Maybe it is simplistic, but it certainly won't be easy. But I don't think there are any shortcuts. There's no magic bullet. We simply need to have honest conversations, and then those honest conversations are themselves incredibly difficult. So one of the things that I show my students in the X class almost every year is a little clip from the Family Research Council where they go about interviewing people on the University of Washington campus. It's really, really interesting, and it's actually deeply upsetting to the students. But this man, I want to say he's a fairly short Caucasian male who basically goes around saying, "What would you say if I told you I was a woman?" And the student kind of says, "Well, I'm not sure I agree with you, but you're not hurting anybody, so hey, good for you. Sure, I don't have any problem with that. What would you say if I were an African American woman? It's like, no, I don't think you are, but hey, again, you're not hurting anyone, and who am I to say? I mean, literally, student after student, and then he gets to a student and basically says, what would you say if I said I was a 6'4" African American woman? And you could just kind of see her just kind of, totally, there's a line in the sand. You are not 6'4", buddy. And it's hilarious. It really is. So, but we are in such a polarized political environment. And really, it is the cardinal offense in our society right now to come off as judgmental. We are really, really cautious, if not, maybe the adjective I should use is even stronger, about speaking even about the plain facts. And by plain facts, I mean telling somebody that, you are a 5'9" white male. I'm sorry, that's just, I don't mean any disrespect, I don't mean to hurt your feelings, but that's who you are. People can be offended by the facts, and that's just kind of where we're at. So this is just to underscore the challenge that we have to have an honest public discussion about even the very simplest things, let alone, public policy, the nature of God, and all the contentious ethical and political debates of our time. Hopefully we will not continue to be, 2 or 3 galaxies hurtling, apart from one another. Because right now that's what it seems like. You just cannot have any kind of holding hands across the aisle politically right now. And that's a shame. And I think that's not always been the case.
Just a comment on what you were talking about. I've got a friend who suggests that when he's starting to get into a political argument with somebody on the other side, he always suggests opening the conversation with something like, well, what kind of a society would you like to live in? That kind of thing. And he says frequently that breaks down a whole bunch of walls, because it gets people talking about themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a great way to do it. One of the other things I do is, when someone comes up to me and says, I don't believe in God, I will ask them, tell me about this God you don't believe in. And usually, at the end of, what ends up, I think, actually being very cathartic for them, because they're actually able to say all the things that they hate about God and blah, blah, blah. Then they look at me and I basically say, yeah, I don't believe in that God either. Yeah. And then we've opened the discussion to something much more powerful in their lives. What a lot of people will say to me, again, is, I haven't had religious experiences. And I say, I bet you have, and you just didn't realize they were. So these conversations are complicated, but I think that if we get the other person talking and we develop a rapport and they realize that our priority is not about being right, but having a relationship with them is the first step to having something, very beautiful go on. So.
Is there any overlap between, is natural law scientific law? And there's some overlap there, and they're in alignment, and they're not necessarily in contradiction, right? They almost seem to be this. You talk about a plant and you water a plant. Science would, say the same thing. So I'm just curious about what you think about that.
Yes, in fact, it's funny because, for instance, Jean Porter in her book, The Recovery of Virtue, when she talks about natural law, one of the objections that she tries to head off at the pass is this kind of knee-jerk reaction to, oh my gosh, if I believe in natural law, then we're talking about objective rules that we all have to obey. It's way too objective. But from a scientific standpoint, that actually ought to be very appealing to us because there are verifiable scientific, conclusions that we can draw about the natural world. And again, if those didn't matter to us at all, if they didn't guide our action in any way, that would seem to be an indication of something wrong with us, not with something wrong with the world. So, on the other hand, Aquinas and Aristotle, while saying that there is a very common understanding of good for all human beings that we can generally label as happiness, the Greek term is eudaimonia, that doesn't mean that there's not individual variation, right? So what's going to make you happy and me happy probably is going to include things like friendship, purpose in life, some kind of calling or vocation, however that calling or vocation plays out, and basically a concrete form of life that has all these particular elements that satisfy us intellectually, emotionally, spiritually, and so on. But that's going to look a little bit different depending on how you're built, right? So a lot of you are not Dominican friars, and you probably are not unhappy about that. And if everyone wanted to be a Dominican friar, my priory would be even more full than it is right now. So it's a good thing that we all have our own personal vocations. So what fulfills us in terms of the activities we do, in terms of the relationships we have, in terms of the forms of life that we find satisfying and that give meaning to our existence, is going to have a personal mark. And just because we can give that a very generalized structure by talking about virtues and the importance of friendship and the love of God, doesn't mean that there isn't personal variation. But I think that a respect for kind of the basic science is, I think, hardwired into natural law. Natural law and science both agree that, things have determinate natures, and that we can discover, sometimes, relatively easy, sometimes it takes us many centuries, but we can eventually discover some very important things that ought to impact our actions. Yeah.
Thank you. This has been really comprehensive and overwhelming. A question is, which I guess complements my son's question, is the role of epistemology, which is the philosophy of the science, which is really bypassing, I guess, 500 years of philosophy, but with what Aquinas says, as well, what is the role of nature for Aquinas? How does he define nature?
Oh, very good. Well, part of it is the natural law, of course, is going to be our apprehension of the eternal law. So he's going to have basically a theologically devoted understanding of the natural order to things, and therefore of nature. But again, nature has everything to do with what things are in themselves and in their relationships to other things. Whereas later on, you're going to have, just to use Hume again as an example, nature that does not have this kind of ontological foundation, or what we might say, and this is a very technical term, ontological oomph. And nature is emptied of its intelligibility, and it becomes a kind of regularity. That is, we start talking about nature in terms of what kind of generally tends to happen most of the time. And then, if we decide to change that, we're now talking about what is artificial. So this is, the term nature actually has a number of different meanings that kind of morph. For the tradition, there are a couple different senses that weave together. So a nature has everything to do with what something is, but it has everything to do also with what is perfective. And that's going to be fundamental for Aristotle and Aquinas, is that once we could say that kind of those scientific facts under our belt, then we have a really good idea about what will be good and perfective for this thing, and what will tear it down and destroy it. Yeah.
Thank you. This is excellent. This might not be a fair question, but if you had to pinpoint the beginning of this disconnect between, humans' understanding of the relationship between natural law and regular law and all this discussion that you've had today, where would you say it begins? I know the Enlightenment, but that's kind of fuzzy. But can we just get a little specific?
I'm laughing because This is not a uncontroversial issue. And I'm not a historian. You may have, all of you probably are familiar with Father Augustine Thompson. Father Augustine Thompson will pepper his lecture courses from time to time by saying, I don't know anything about that, I'm just a simple historian. In this case, I'm going to reverse him and say, I don't know anything about that historical stuff, I'm simply a lowly philosopher. There are all sorts of opinions about that, and it's hard to pinpoint. There is a movement called Radical Orthodoxy. This is John Milbank and Catherine Pickstock and the like, and they tend to be located in the UK and very vaguely Anglican. But their idea is that the beginning of the end was John Duns Scotus. So Scotus was the beginning of the end. I think that you have already, at least by the time of William of Ockham and the later voluntarists, an emphasis on the will and divine transcendence, which tends to empty things of their intelligibility. So God could have created, and at any moment could, alter his decision and completely reorder things such that the structure of the world is more a expression of the divine will than the divine wisdom or intelligence. And then you'll have people who say, well, even late voluntarism wasn't so bad. Everything went to hell in a handbasket with Descartes. Descartes is one of the favorite whipping boys of the continental tradition, for instance. So, so this idea that we no longer have an integrated world, but we have sort of thinking things, res cogitans, and extended things, res extensa. And res extensa is basically just extension and then a mechanical world of pushes and pulls. And then we have this kind of dualistic soul-like thing that's just thinking that's completely immaterial, and that we can't actually even explain how it interacts with the physical world. This is where things really start to come apart. I want to say that there are probably problems with Scotus and voluntarism and Occam and Descartes, all of them. So when exactly things started to fall apart, my only conviction as a Dominican is that everything was fine with Aquinas. Which is probably not 100% true, but it's 99.9% true. So. Anyone else? Okay, well, let me just wrap up by saying thank you very much for being here. And again, if anyone is inspired to be more involved in Dominican school, if you would like to register for a course, because of course you don't have to actually enroll in a degree program to come and enroll in a DSPT class. Father Hillary teaches wonderful classes, and we have a whole list of faculty. Please don't hesitate to talk to Aaron and our president, Peter Rogers, over there. Also, if you'd like to give to the Dominican school, we're very needy, we're beggars, that's what we are, we're Dominicans. Please do consider giving to the Dominican school. And finally, if these Saturday talks are something that you love and you'd like to see more of, don't hesitate to say so and maybe even suggest something that you'd like to hear more about. So we'd love to hear from you either way. And thank you again for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful Advent season.
Thank you, thank you.